Growth Commission. Welcome to our event here at the Reform Conference. It's great to have you here. Very quick run through of what's going to happen. Shanker Singham, our chairman, will give some introductory remarks. Then Ewen Stewart, another of our commissioners, will add to those. And Richard Tice, the deputy leader of Reform, will be joining us very shortly. He's coming for another event, but he will then join us and he will then contribute. And there'll be an opportunity for questions from the floor. And so on, and we'll certainly be done by 2 o'clock. There are, by the way, leaflets on your chairs which explain a bit more about the work of the Growth Commission. There is also a QR code on there, so if you want to learn more about the Growth Commission, you can sign up to our mailing list, which I'd encourage you to do, and keep in touch with all we're up to. And right on cue, Richard has arrived, so the full panel is here. I will hand over to Shanker Singham to kick us off. Shanker.
So actually, brilliant. Hi, sorry, right. We have a, just to keep you on your toes, folks, good afternoon, and lovely to see you. Sorry I'm late. Slight twist in the timing of things because I've got to go on the main stage to make a very special announcement in 15 minutes' time about what's happening at 3 o'clock, which is a very special speaker you will not want to miss. So I thought, if it's okay, I'm going to kick off, then go and do that, and then come back as you hear from the real experts. I'm just a sort of I don't know, I'm a happy amateur maybe, but anyway, this is such an important subject of growth because of course we haven't basically had any in real terms per person. Growth has been declining and is essentially completely and utterly flat. And we've had this sort of mirage where for 2 decades we've been told we need mass immigration in order to create growth. And so, yes, we've sort of trickled up in GDP terms, but when you look at GDP per person, growth per person, what we've actually had is declining growth. And the simple number I use is in the 1990s, per person, real wages was growing about 2.8% per year for a decade. Amongst friends, let's call that 30%. But in the decade between, I think, 05 and 15, real growth per person was 0. And it's not done much better since, and it's currently basically flatlining. And that's a real problem, because that means a 25-year-old plumber now is earning 30% less in a decade than their confrere a couple of decades ago. And growth really matters. So the combined GDP of the EU and the US about 15 years ago was about the same. Now, if you look at that number, the GDP in the US is about 60% higher than across the EU, which sort of tells you all you need to know. Growth matters because it makes us more prosperous, better off, and it enables us to have higher tax revenues. That's part of the Laffer curve. And that means you've got more money to invest in public services, as long as they're properly organized and properly managed. And so we have to have policies that are conducive to growth. But also, when we have got money, you've got to invest it properly. And that's why, and you've got to stop wasting money. And I'll touch on that in more detail later in my speech. But some of you may be aware I gave a press conference at the beginning of the week about local government pension schemes, the rights and, of benefits and entitlements of those schemes, obviously sacrosanct for employees and retirees, but performance matters when you manage money. And the performance of those pension schemes, as they invest in things, matters, because if you perform better, then in a defined benefit pension scheme, then the employer can contribute a bit less, which means the taxpayer, if it's a council scheme, can employ less. So if you're overpaying fees and underperforming, well, firstly, you should be fired, But secondly, it's ultimately the taxpayer in council areas that pick up the tab. So I've highlighted this egregious scandal, and it is a scandal. Nationally in England and Wales, you're talking about a total of 8 to 11 billion pounds per annum. That literally deals probably with providing much, much better social care across England and Wales. So growth matters, whether it's at the council level, but also at the national level. And we have to set in place policies that create growth. So in our contract that I'm sure you've all read word by word, and that you can memorize off by heart, but in our contract last July, we set out a series of spending cuts, regulation issues and cuts, and we then talked about a series of tax cuts that would create growth. And those who wish to attack us and criticize us only focused on one side of the P&L, where they said, well, you've got all these tax cuts and they're all unfunded. To which I say, well, why didn't you look at the other side of the P&L? So Nick Robinson and I had a bit of a ding-dong yesterday morning, some of you may have seen, where he was being ridiculous. But anyway, the first page of our contract last year, the very first page when we talked about what we would do was talk about savings. And savings matter because if you create the savings, then you can afford to invest that in the tax cuts. But all of us here probably understand the Laffer curve. And it's all about incentives. You've got to make work pay, you've got to make risk-taking pay. But if you're taxed to high hell, excuse my French, then a lot of people are saying, well, I'm not going to bother. And you end up with a ludicrous situation where investment's down, spending's down, jobs are down, and you've got an extra million people on benefits since the election. So we gave a sort of a direction of travel, and that's what it was, a direction of travel of the sort of things that we need to do. Reducing corporation tax. The best thing, dear old George Osborne, I surprised him the other day, nearly fell over when I bumped into him, and I said, I was flattering you the other day, because reducing corporation tax from 28 down to 19 over a period of time with a direction of travel to 17 was very smart. Corporation tax revenues soared. And then Sunak did the ludicrous reversal of that. And they didn't actually make enough of that. So that was a very good thing. Actually, if you make work pay for the least well off, the lowest paid, by lifting the starting point of paying income tax to 20 grand from 12 grand, as opposed to freezing the threshold, then more people will say, yeah, it's worth me going to work because I'll have more in my pocket at the end of the month or in the bank balance than if I stay on benefits, which, by the way, are tax-free. Quite a big difference. Most people don't know that. So in all of these different areas, growth matters. It's absolutely critical. And we've got gurus here, Shanker and Ewen and Jonathan, who focus on this daily. And it probably keeps you awake at night. And it's domestic growth. And we've just been talking about also investing in infrastructure and local, local growth of local ideas and businesses. 3i, many of us will remember 3i in the 60s, 70s and 80s with their regional offices were great investors in small growth firms. And I think we've lost a bit of that and we need to relook at it. So all of this stuff is really, really important in its various different ways. We understand it. We're from the world of business. We're deadly serious about it. But because we've been spending way more than we're earning in recent years, we've got the bond markets basically in charge. And they are a bit grumpy at the moment, you may have noticed. And they are particularly grumpy with the Chancellor. And they apply currently a thing called the moron premium. Literally in the city, it's called the moron premium. UK gilts because of the state of our Chancellor and this government. So they have to be reassured that we need to get to a point where we're earning more than we're spending, and we need to start by saving vast amounts of wasteful, unproductive spending in the public sector. And if we do that alongside getting rid of lots of daft regulation, then we can afford what I call performance-related tax cuts. And I think that's a key message as we move over the next couple of years to make sure that they understand that. And I've started meetings with people from lots of businesses, the city, and from the bond markets. So people shouldn't worry about anything. we did make hundreds of millions of pounds for shareholders in our various business careers, not because we're muppets, but because we understand how to create value, create growth, and that cash flow matters, and we understand about balance sheets and all of that. And I think it's probably fair to say, when I look in the House of Commons on PMQs, I'm looking around, I don't see many people who've got the sort of track record that we've got in reform. And I think it's really important. We'll keep banging that message. And if we keep banging that message, then I think people will say, yep, these folks, they get it, they understand it. And that's how we get this economy growing again. Because to conclude, we all remember in the 80s and 90s, we were growing at 2.5% to 3.5% a year. Anyone remember that? And if it was less than 2%, we got a little bit worried. Less than 1% was considered a moral recession. They get to 1% now and they break out the champagne. Our Rachel thinks it's marvellous. I don't call that growth. It's barely a round of drinks. And on that happy note, I will wrap up for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And that was actually a very good intro to what we're going to talk about. So I chair something called the Growth Commission. The Growth Commission is a non-partisan group of economists from around the world. We have 7 members of our commission who have served in the Reagan, Bush, and Trump administrations. I've also served in the Obama administration as a cleared advisor, which is something people don't know about. And we also have the former head of the Mexican Competition Commission, former WTO ambassador of Mexico, a former Indian chief economic advisor, 2 Japanese economists as well. So our focus is to advise the G7 principally about why, the point that Richard just made, why economic growth in the G7 has stalled for the last 30 years. The US is a little bit of an exception, but the rest of the G7 has been pitiful in terms of economic growth over the last 30 years. And just to explain and sort of put in a picture the law of big numbers, one of the things Tyler Cowen, one of our Growth Commission members, talks about is if the US economy had grown 1% less year on year from 1890 to 1980, it would be smaller than the economy of Mexico in 1980. So that is the effect of a little bit less growth year on year. Now, what people don't realize, although Richard just explained it, is that we've had this lack of growth in the UK for about 30 years. It goes actually before the economic crisis in 2008. So if we continue down this path, the debt to GDP ratio of the country, which is already, I would argue, unsustainable, becomes a huge black hole that we will never be able to climb out of. Our focus is, as I say, how do you break this cycle? How do you actually generate some economic growth in the G7? How do you get back to those sort of 2.5 to 3.5% GDP per capita growth rates that we've seen in the past? So we've developed, and I'd invite you to go to our website, which is www.growth-commission.com. We've done reports to the UK, we've done reports to the US, we've done reports on Japan and other countries, but we use a model, and I'm not going to go into the detail of the model here, but those of you who are interested, we have, go to the website, we have a couple of books that I've written about the economic model. But basically, just to say, what are we trying to achieve with economic growth? Why does growth matter, to sort of ask the question that Richard posed at the beginning? Well, it matters because several sort of fundamental principles. One, wealth can be created or destroyed. By wealth, I mean the realization of ideas. Money is a measurement. It's a way of measuring how successful you are at realizing ideas. wealth is very easy to destroy and very hard to create. And competition is the most powerful force we know to actually create wealth. So our economic model looks at three fundamental pillars of growth that are highly correlated to changes in GDP per capita. And those three pillars are: how open is your trade environment, how competitive is your domestic regulatory system, and how well do you protect property rights. Those three things, it turns out, are the fundamental drivers of economic growth. And what our model shows is that they don't all operate equally. So if you improve, so we have a model where we have a scale, each country is on a scale of 1 to 7 for each of these pillars. If you improve a country by about 15 to 20%, in other words, you make it more open to trade by 20%, you get a typically 2 to 4% increase in GDP per capita from one state to the other state. So that depends on how long it takes to do that. So it's not an immediate effect, but 2 to 4% for trade openness, about 6 to 7% for property rights. But the biggest one by far is how competitive your domestic regulatory system is. And what I mean by that is, how close are you to competition policy as an organizing economic principle? Not government distortion, not government intervention, but actual voluntary exchange, willing buyers, willing sellers, with a minimum of distortions between them. How close are you to that? And that turns out to be the thing that drives GDP per capita more than anything else. So what would you do, knowing all that? When the UK leaves the EU, what would you do? You would focus on improving your domestic regulatory system, which you can now do because you're no longer under the control of Brussels. What did we do from 2016 to now? Almost nothing. Almost nothing on the most important pillar of economic growth. We did a little bit on trade that was good, but we are rapidly undoing the good that we did in trade by locking into the world's most protectionist trading regime, which is the trading regime of the European Union. So knowing this stuff, you can determine how to prioritize what you should be doing. I want to show you what happened. What this graph shows you, and this graph, if there's nothing else today that you take away this image. Because if this image doesn't make you angry, I don't think anything's going to make you angry. So the bottom line here, the yellow line, the baseline, is the historic record of the UK in the last 20 years. So we project forward. If we grow at the rate we've grown in the last, it's 10 years actually, this is what you get in 2040. This is the level of GDP per capita in US dollars. This is what you get. The orange line is the OBR estimate of what the UK economy is going to look like in 2040. We then applied the reform and a very, as I say, 20% improvement in those three pillars, which over this period of 15 years should not be impossible to achieve. It's quite a modest proposal. And the red line shows you what the GDP per capita of the UK would look like if, in 2040, if we did that. And the sort of magenta line, I think Nigel must be signing T-shirts or something. The magenta line is the, if you also add to that the tax improvements that we've recommended in the Growth Commission. So Richard talked about corporation tax, 19% under Osborne going down to 17%. We've said corporation tax needs to come down to 15%. That's our recommendation. And the income tax needs to be simplified and so on. But if you do those tax reform proposals as well, you get almost $80,000 GDP per capita in the next 15 years by 2040. Just to put this all in context, in the early 2000s, UK GDP per capita and US GDP per capita were about the same. we are now 40% poorer than the US. We are poorer than the poorest state in the US, which is Mississippi. Germany is poorer than the second poorest state in the US, which is West Virginia. So Europe and the UK have fallen away considerably from where we were in the early 2000s. If we did these things, we would get some of that back. Not all of it. We'd get to about 70% of US GDP per capita, as it would be at that time. But right now we're dropping, right? So we are going to be, our GDP per capita will be overtaken by Slovenia next year. It will be overtaken by Poland the year after that. All those Polish plumbers are going to go back to Poland because the GDP per capita in Poland will be higher than the UK. So why have we got to this point? Massive institutional failure that we've seen. Richard talked about the sort of the way the media and so on looks at proposals. It's a very static modelling that the Bank of England, the Treasury, the OBR tend to use. They don't think about dynamic effects. You know, most of you are in businesses. You know about dynamic effects. You know about incentives. You know how quickly people react to incentives. And our models are dynamic models, so they pick this up. The use of the GDP number has masked what's really happening, because we're adding 1 million a year to the population, largely through immigration. So obviously, you know, GDP per capita, GDP might be improving by 0.1 or 0.2%, which is disastrous, but it's positive. But GDP per capita, because that is obviously, you know, when you take out the effects of immigration, GDP per capita is negative. It has been negative for some time. We are in a GDP per capita recession, and we have been in one for some time. So what do we do about all of this? So what we've done is we've looked at various things, and we've prioritized certain things in the UK that we think absolutely move the needle and get us to those kinds of improvements. So obviously, everybody talks about planning and housing. It is very important. It does move the needle enormously. So we talk about zone-based planning, trusted planners, basically sharing uplift on rezoning. There's a lot of ideas that we've suggested in our Growth Commission reports that are quite dramatic with respect to planning reform. If you are not dealing with the problem of statutory consultees and you're not dealing with the judicial review process, you're not going to fix planning at all. If you exempt whole areas, you're not going to fix planning at all. Tax reform, lower the main corporation tax, get it down to that 15% level. These are radical proposals, or they might be regarded as radical proposals, because we are in an emergency situation here. So that's why we have adopted this approach. Abolish inheritance tax. We think that's a highly damaging tax in terms of your incentives, particularly for small businesses, particularly for entrepreneurial companies. Some of the expensing has been done by the previous government, in other words, corporate expensing for certain assets. Stamp duty reform. Energy. Energy is the biggest challenge that this country probably faces. We have the higher energy cost at almost 50 cents per kilowatt hour. It is 3 times as much as the US energy cost. You cannot be a successful nation with the energy costs that we have. It has got to come down. The only way it's going to come down is a refocus on competition in the electricity sector in terms of interconnection and so forth. You know, there's a whole slew of environmental regulation that is anti-competitive, that has grown in the last 20 or 30 years. All of that has to go. That has to be removed. And every regulation has to be looked at from the lens of what effect does this have on trade? What effect does it have on competition? That's not to say you wouldn't ever regulate. What it does mean, though, is that you look at the effect of regulation on competition, because that's what destroys wealth, and you say, well, is that acceptable given the regulatory goal? And it may be. And that is, frankly, that is up to the people to decide. But you have to know how much this is costing you. And that's what has been lacking, frankly, in the UK. And some of this is not new. I mean, the Competition and Markets Authority made recommendations about the energy sector back in 2015 that were completely ignored by the government of the day. Carbon border adjustment mechanism, sort of more sort of net zero stuff. The UK is going to align to the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. We are also going to align with their emissions trading scheme. What this does is it takes whole ranges of products out of your authority to lower tariffs and do trade deals. It also increases the price of basic things. This is steel, cement, fertilizers for farmers, etc. All of the prices, those prices are going to go up as a result of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we've just signed up to. So we would recommend eliminating that. We would lower non-tariff barriers. We've inherited a lot of non-tariff barriers and regulatory regulatory burden from our membership of the EU, and we do not need to have those. We would advocate a root and branch reform of the regulatory system, not unlike what the US is doing now. What the US is doing now is looking through all of its domestic regulation to determine what regulation is anti-competitive with a view to eliminating that regulation. And we should do something similar, we would argue. Labour market. One of the biggest drivers of that domestic competition, of that improvement, and that GDP per capita, that 11% GDP per capita improvement, is labour market flexibility. And we have a vision in this country that we have a very flexible labour market. And I'm telling you that compared to, I've worked in about 80 countries, compared to the fastest growing countries in the world, we do not have a flexible labour market. And we are about to make it even more inflexible. So when you have a minimum wage that is 67% of median income, which is more than any other OECD country, you have a problem, and you're exporting unemployment at the youth level if you have a minimum wage that is that high. So we would reduce, actually, dismissal redundancy costs. What makes it hard to fire people makes it hard to hire people, especially if you are a small company or an entrepreneurial company. We have rules that make it impossible to fire certain classes of workers. So we would strengthen all of those participation incentives. And then on infrastructure, we've advocated, rather than nationalising, I mean, who remembers British Rail? Well, okay, so calling it great does not make it great, right? Great British Rail is not going to be great. It's going to be just like British Rail. And so, in fact, again, in 2015, the Competition and Markets Authority basically said that what you should do is you should have on-rail competition. We created a rail privatization where none of the rail companies actually compete with each other. So, I mean, you're not going to change your route because somebody's price has gone up or the service has gone down. So, but you can do that. We do it with airlines. You can do it in rail. Again, recommendation of the CMA, totally ignored by the government. And then public sector productivity, and finally trade. What we need to do with public sector productivity is there's a whole range of things we need to do about procurement reform. Procurement reform is very skewed towards large incumbent companies. Trade and deregulation, again, use the opportunity of opening up your trade system, of liberalizing your trade system to improve your domestic regulatory environment. Now, we have a big opportunity here in the UK because, as Winston Churchill said, sometimes the old world needs to be rescued by the new. There is a olive branch from the US in terms of trade deals, but they will require us to improve our regulatory system, particularly in the area of agricultural regulation, which again is a holdover from European Union agricultural regulation designed to protect French farmers. That is what it's designed to do. Well, we can change all of that, and we would certainly advocate changing that. So now I'm going to hand over to Ewen. There you go.
Thank you very much indeed, Shanker. I thought we'd start with a pretty picture to show that the Growth Commission and Reform take the long view. We have a glorious picture of the fall of Rome. The fall of Rome ascribed to 476 AD, a particular day. But it's quite wrong to say the fall of Rome happened in one day. It happened over a period of 100 or more years as the Roman Empire lost its influence. In our country, I genuinely believe there is a genuine risk of the fall of Great Britain. Let it not be thus, and let us show you how we can change that when Richard is Chancellor. So, let's go back. The last 30 or so years have been lots of small incisions into this country, declining our productivity, increasing the size of the state, and reducing our wealth. As Shanker said very clearly, there is a growth emergency. Your example of America against Mexico is salutary, and this country has barely grown in the last 30 years. But what we have here is the 120-year view of the British state, and I think we're on the road to serfdom. A.J.P. Taylor said, an Englishman born in 1913, his only interaction of the state, if he was law-abiding, was the local bobby and the postman. If only that was the case today. We have swapped freedom to be one of the most controlled states in the world. The state now accounts for almost half of the entire economy, but that is a significant underestimate because industry after industry is regulated to within an inch of its life. The financial services industry was unregulated at the start of my career. It is not thus today. The energy sector was relatively free. It is certainly not thus today. And as Shanker's explained, our power prices are the most expensive in the OECD, and there's little wonder there's little industry left as a result. The situation is getting worse, not better. The Conservative and Labour parties have both increased the size of the state rapidly over the last 30 years. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister, the private sector was 2/3 of the economy. Today, it's roughly half. What has happened is we've swapped a productive private sector for a broadly unproductive public sector. Shanker talked about the productivity of the public sector. The government monitors these stats themselves. Extraordinarily, they say the productivity of the public sector is lower today than it was in 1997. How conceivably can that be the case, given the technological advantages that we've had over the last 20 years? You're also well aware, despite the going hand in hand with the growth of the public sector, is tax. Taxes, as a matter of record, are at the highest they've been in this country since 1948 and are likely to rise yet further. It is little wonder that the private sector is literally squealing. Not only are they content to tax us at record levels, but Britain's debt has increased exponentially. 25 years ago, Britain was one of the strongest balance sheets in all Europe. Today, our debt to GDP is almost 100% of GDP, and we're firmly in the bottom quartile. And indeed, only Greece has increased its debt levels more over the last 20 years. So consider the growth of the state, much higher taxation, and debt levels that have spiraled. Have you seen better services for this extraordinary largesse? I don't think you have. Shanker had a very powerful slide that showed our chronic underperformance. If there's one slide I'd ask you to remember from my presentation, it is that between the Napoleonic Wars and 2000, Britain's accumulated debt was about 400 billion. So what took 200 years reached 400 billion. On the eve of global financial crisis, the Blair government increased it to 661 billion. Cameron becomes Prime Minister, it's over $1 trillion. On the eve of COVID, it was 1.9 trillion. Today, it's 3.1 trillion, and on my estimates, it will be 4 trillion within another 5 or 6 years. That's an 8-fold increase in debt in a short generation. For what? Richard talked about, I can't remember his exact expression, was it the dumb premium or the moron premium? Or the moron premium. Here we have the moron premium for you to see. The 30-year bond yielding 5.6% is the city's judgment on this lamentable government, and it is lamentable. That's the highest yield curve in almost 30 years. A critical state of affairs. And as we pontificate in this country with a pathetic debate, we need to consider what's happening globally. 30 years ago, China accounted for 3% of global GDP. Today, it is, on a purchasing power parity basis, the largest economy in the world. We are drinking, not just in this country, but in all Europe, out of the last chance saloon, literally. We are becoming irrelevant. We are stagnating, and we are seeking to grow, and it's been our choice because other OECD countries have grown. The chart I have not put in this presentation is while British growth has averaged about 1% per annum over the last 30 years, which, as Shanker points out, is rather less after migration, very much less. Actually, Australia has grown by over 50% over that period. Even woke Canada has grown by 40%, and the United States has grown by 40%. As Shanker pointed out, Britain has moved from being marginally poorer than America to 40% poorer. No wonder the country is up in arms, metaphorically. I couldn't resist this, as a Scotsman, slightly indulgent picture of the Scots Greys charging at Waterloo. But is this the end? Is this really to be the end of our influence? There's a way out of this, and I'll show you in a second how. But there was a Scottish economist and philosopher called Adam Ferguson, roughly the same time as Adam Smith. And he devised something called Ferguson's Law. And what Ferguson's Law basically states is that any great power that spends more on servicing its debt than defence risks ceasing to be a great power. Will we see how Britain does on that measure? Do we think it does well? Funnily enough, it doesn't do well. We fail that test by 100%. We're spending twice as much on debt repayment, 160 billion, compared with about 60 to 70 billion, depending on how you measure it, on defence. There's only one European country. America's just breached the ratio at 100, actually, and in the long term, that's extremely concerning for them. The only European country that comes close to being solvent, dare I say, is Germany, but that's partly a function of lower debt levels and partly a function of pretty limited at the moment defence expenditure. But frankly, the major European and American powers are in very serious trouble on this, but none is more serious than Britain. So, should we just all give up and go away? I don't think we should. We wouldn't be here if that's what we thought, is it? So, there's no short-term fix here. The destruction of our economy has taken 30 or 40 years. And it would be dishonest to say there's a magic wand. But what I think we can do quite quickly is give hope. And if we can turn the delta and people can see they're getting slightly better off, they will start to understand that only by trusting the people and the private sector and wealth creation can this country afford the public sector that it has and actually pay its way in the world. Britain spends, if you look at Britain's expenditure, 1.3 trillion in public spending, 28 million households, that's £46,000. It's an absolute joke. What do you get for £46,000 from the state, your family? Not very much. There is wanton waste in the system, wanton waste. So I'm going to make a number of modest proposals as to how we can improve things. When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he increased public spending by £200 million in real terms. I don't think anyone thinks their GP is better or their schools are better or we have more tanks in the field. We have none of those things. £200 billion in real terms. My first proposal is that a reform government, and this is my idea, not policy, but I hope there's sympathy for it, is that we seek to reverse that excess spending. And we can do that, I think, without reducing the quality of service, and we start to recycle that into tax cuts and to grow the productive economy. We still will have a massive state at that point, over 40% of GDP, large by historical standards, but if we can achieve that, we can then start to reduce the size of the state in the long term, not by cutting services, but by growing the private sector, which will allow those public services to continue, but create prosperity and wealth for us all. Shanker talked about the extraordinarily decadent net zero and energy policy we have in this country, and I'm pleased to say that reform will absolutely seek to reverse net zero madness. It's truly extraordinary that a country that has enormous carbon assets choose to leave them in the ground and basically use Chinese technology for extremely expensive and intermittent power, which makes our power about 3 to 4 times more expensive than in the United States of America. Is there any wonder that our industrial base is so weak? There's an easy win there. Regulation. I have a modest proposal that there's a presumption to repeal every new piece of legislation, regulation over the last 5 years unless there's an obvious reason not to do so. One of Britain's most successful industries is football. And we even have a football regulator now. Absolutely extraordinary. But the most important message is trust the people. I don't know what's right for your families at all. It's up to you to know what's right for your family. We need to trust the people, free the people. This country in the past was a hugely successful country. In many, many fields, we were a force for good. It's not too late to reverse this. We have one last chance, and I very much hope we take that chance, and I'm sure we will. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewen, very much indeed. Can I briefly give Richard the chance to respond, and then we'll open up to some questions from the floor?
Thank you. Amazing. I'm so sorry I had to disappear, but I had to make a very, very important announcement, which I can now share you, which is that at about 3:15, the Planet Normal discussion and debate between Liam Halligan and Alison Pearson will include a very, very special guest, someone who I met in the summer in prison. Yes, for the first time, Lucy Connolly will be on the main stage talking to all of us in Reform at about 3:15. That's all about free speech. This, of course, is about doing the right thing to become more prosperous. Some of those graphs, gents, I mean, I've seen some of them before, but they are truly shocking. In fact, one of them, of course, is out of date because it was done a week ago on the cost of 30-year debt, which hit, I think, on Wednesday or Thursday, hit 5.75%, and the risk of going north. So growth really matters. I'm going to be talking about it on stage later when I speak, so I have to take some questions.
Right, I'm going to come out in the audience, and I saw 2 people in the front row first.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. My name's Tom Scottson from Politics Home and the House magazine. Richard, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions. One was very interesting with the growth discussion, but as a reform government, if it gets elected, do you see debt to GDP falling by the end of your term? And would you describe yourself as someone closer to a Hayekian or a Keynesian, for example? Thank you.
I see myself as Tice, no one else. And I do see that we have to get debt to GDP down, but the way to do that is through growth and by bluntly slashing unproductive spending and slashing unproductive daft regulations. And it's remarkable that 20 years ago, our tax as a percentage of GDP was down about, give or take, 35%. or a touch lower, I think 30 years ago, and now it's in the mid-40s. So we have to, if we create growth, then debt to GDP goes down, and tax as a percentage of GDP also goes down. So that has to be the holy grail. And we've got to put ourselves back in charge, not the bond markets.
I just add one thing to that, which is, when we talk about debt to GDP and the size of the debt, I mean, people don't realise that we're now spending 120, 130 billion on debt servicing. The NHS cost is about 190 billion. So if you add those two together, you're north of 300 billion before you even get started. So these debates that we have about 5 billion here and 5 billion there is just almost pointless. And the only thing that will solve this is economic growth. And if you see the difference between a 2.7% growth rate or a 3.7% growth rate and what that does to bend the curve, it's really quite dramatic.
The compounding effect of growth is extraordinary, just extraordinary.
Hi, I'm Natasha Norris from Planning Magazine. We heard earlier about the link between planning policy and house building and growth. So wondered, Richard, what reforms priorities will be in terms of planning policy and planning for housing and development?
So it's very much my topic because I am actually a real estate guy. I've been involved in building thousands of homes. And look, it's a catastrophe what's going on. How can you spend £1.2 billion getting planning for a river crossing without putting a shovel in the ground? Or £800 million getting planning that they've not yet fully got to build an extra runway and not have a digger on site? It's insane. I was told by a house builder this week that this government will be lucky to get to 750,000 homes in a parliamentary term. So we've got to we've got to ease the unnecessary costs of getting planning consents. We've got to have, I think, a much greater, more tax incentivized way of developing on brownfield first. And if we freeze immigration, we're not short of people in this country. If you freeze immigration, you freeze the pressure on housing numbers. So let's get building in the brownfield sites. In towns like Boston and Skegness, the quantity of brownfield sites where you could build hundreds and hundreds of homes is enormous. And that's the same up and down the country. 30 years ago, you could get planning consent for 50 houses for 10 grand. Now that'll probably cost you £500,000 to £750,000. It's insane.
Can I just add one other point? I get off at Berwick rail station quite regularly, and there's a large banner there. And I don't know if you know that station, but there's a beautiful stone viaduct. And it was built in about 1860 by Robert Stevenson. And it was built in 6 months. 6 months. And it was built so well, it didn't require any repairs for over 100 years. How long would it take us to build a bridge like that today? We've been able to do it in the past. We simply cannot do it today, and it's down to the planning laws and the absurd regulations that we have in this country.
Thank you. Jackie Gardner from Coventry City Council. I'm a councillor. I was listening and used to sit on planning committee, so I really understand some of what you're talking about here. I'm interested in the notion of when you get a planning permission comes through for housing, you said on your list up there that you wouldn't be able to use it or lose it, I think you said. The system already exists for that, but the problem is that people can come back for a second bite of the cherry. So what would the reforms plan be to actually enforce use it or lose it? Thanks.
Yeah, so currently it's valid for about, I think, 3 years, isn't it, post it actually being properly approved. It used to be 5 years. Look, the issue is, for too many people now, for too many house builders, it's no longer viable. And you've got to be sensible about affordable housing. The reality is 50% of nothing is nothing. 20% of something is something. So the time, money, effort spent negotiating viability programs around affordable housing is just insane. It's bonkers. We've got to be much simpler and come up with a number, a formula that everybody understands, that cuts all of that out. And I think that is really, really important. I mean, just to be clear, in London, I think housing starts in the first quarter of this year was about 1,500 homes. 1,500 in the whole of London. I think their target was 80,000.
Yeah, and I'd just say one thing about you're a local councillor, so you know that local councillors are paralysed by the fear of judicial review. And Section 106 officers are terrified to do anything because of judicial review. So unless you change the presumption and change the way that judicial review is used to block any kind of activity, and you substantially change the role of statutory consultees, who, as you know, weigh in at the very last moment with 500-page documents that then stall the process. So, you have to get into the weeds of those two things. So I would judge any government's approach to planning reform by how those two things are affected. If they're not affected, that's not really reform.
Hi, thanks very much to the panel. My name is Jonathan Conley. I'm from a strategic communications company called Inflect. We're based out of Manchester and London. As a northerner myself, I'm particularly interested in regional growth. So I was interested in the panel's views, particularly on Northern Powerhouse Rail, and whether they think that would be a good method to get growth spurred in the north, or if northerners would be better served by tax cuts.
I think Britain for a long time has been, if you take the long view, in the Victorian period, the country was much more balanced. So Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Newcastle and many other places were serious powerhouses. There were stock exchanges around the country, there was industry, and there was a balance between north and south. In the last 20 or 30 years, the only show in town, unfortunately, I say this unfortunately, has been the southeast. It is dominated economically. But technology has changed, and I actually think for the first time, it is just as possible to be set up a business anywhere in the country. The internet, the digital economy allows for the ability to be based in John O'Groats, frankly, within reason. So I think there is a genuine opportunity for Manchester to rejuvenate itself. I actually believe the people that can rejuvenate it are the people of Manchester. I don't really believe it's up to the centre. We can provide the infrastructure and the positive policy framework, but it's up to local communities to have the confidence to set up their own businesses and grow. And you can do it. And you've got the best opportunity I think you had in a generation.
So back in 2019, Nigel and I, when we launched our manifesto, we said back then, scrap HS2, it's going to be a huge, huge white elephant, and invest the money in rail programs that were already ready to go, almost oven ready, in the Midlands and the North. Many of those are still oven ready and have barely progressed. And I would still scrap HS2. In fact, I'm on an event next week talking about some of the numbers. It's still going to, the costs of it are ludicrous. And actually for most people living in the North, what they actually want is not fast rail to London. What they want is fast, effective, comfortable local rail and bus networks in the North, and it can be done, and that's what we should do, and that's where we should invest the money.
And I would just add one thing, and I'd turn the question on its head a little bit by saying that one of the things I think we need to do is the regulatory bias in the UK favours the incumbent. It favours large vested interests, big companies. It does not favour new entrants. It's tilted against entrepreneurial companies. If you change that, you will start to see those companies rise. We have very little in the way of business creation. If you look at the US after COVID, what happened is you had a lot of business deaths, but you also had a lot of business creation. Lots of companies formed. That doesn't happen in the UK. If you look at the FTSE top 30 companies now and you compare them with 30 years ago, it's the same companies. You do that same exercise for the US, totally different companies. You need to create a dynamic economy. If you create a dynamic economy, all the regions will prosper, and I would sort of focus on that.
Hi, Ali Renison, Second Newgate, former government trade advisor. Shanker's probably not surprised that I'm going to ask a question about trade. Probably looking for a little bit of reassurance that unlike Trump, reform is not going to go heavy negatively on tariffs, as an example, and maybe adopt more of the melee approach. But I'm just wondering if that's even factored into some of your thinking at all at this stage. Because during Brexit, trade was huge, but that was just as a means and an argument to why we needed to leave without any attachment to the single market customs union, etc. The noise about trade in itself has really died down, not so much in America, but certainly in the UK since then.
Yeah, well, at least now that we've left the EU, we have actually got our own choice to make our own decisions about trade. And I do chuckle occasionally when this Prime Minister trumpets the brilliant trade deals they're doing. I mean, it is perhaps it might be the only half decent thing he is doing. And it is quite ironic when he says how brilliant his relationship is doing a trade deal with the President of the United States. I mean, the irony of it is extraordinary. So, yeah, look, we've got those options. International trade is very important. The US is our biggest single trading partner both ways. The critical thing, though, is getting a sensible regulatory framework, sort of thing that Shanker's an expert on. And the last thing we should be doing is dynamically aligning ourselves, or whatever you want to call it, ever closer back to the EU. Absolute disaster. Bearing in mind the EU is a failing economic model.
Yeah, I'd just say, just on the Trump trade policy and what's happening there, I think it's very unique and very sui generis to the US, because what he's effectively doing is he's using the size of the US market, and there is no other market like it in terms of GDP per capita and size. You know, there are other countries like Singapore, bigger GDP per capita, but they're tiny, so they're not relevant. This is the only country that can do that, to say, I'm going to use the size of my market and the attractiveness of my market to force down your barriers in other areas that we have not dealt with in the global trading system. That's one strand. I accept there are other strands of it, but I think that's sort of very unique to the US, and certainly wouldn't work at all for the UK.
Thank you. We've got time for more questions, but I'm afraid Richard has got to go and prepare for his speech on the stage, so please show your appreciation to Richard.
Thank you. Shanker, you said at the beginning of your speech something like growth comes from the realization of ideas, I think. You said something like that, basically innovation, but it didn't feature in your talk or anyone else's. If you look at Silicon Valley, the things that created Apple and Google, it was investment in the future generation of scientists and engineers. It was innovation grants coming from government into businesses. It was R&D tax credits. It was getting pension funds to invest into venture capital to put into these innovative small firms so they could grow. Where should that be in reform's agenda and your own prescriptions?
Obviously, I don't speak for reform, but from a growth commission perspective. So what I said is wealth creation. When we talk about wealth creation, wealth is the realization of ideas. So it's the speed with which an idea goes from discovery to being fully realized as a commercial enterprise. How quickly you can make that process is really measured but money is a measurement of that operation. So that's what I was talking about in terms of wealth creation. But your question about innovation, the interesting thing about actually going back to the Trump realignment is obviously one of the strands of the policy is to bring manufacturing back into the US. And the question is, do you have a population that is ready for the jobs of tomorrow? And what I would absolutely say is, when you're talking about education of your workforce, particularly your young people, your students, etc., that's where we need to spend a lot of time and resource. We do not in the West graduate anything like the number of engineers. China and India together, I think it's about 44 to 48% of all graduates in China are engineering graduates. It's about 39% or something in India. It's 8% in the US. It's even less than that here. So if you're not graduating people who have those skills, then they're not. The jobs may be there, but your people won't do them, won't be able to do them. So I do agree that there needs to be focus on that. And also in terms of education, it's not just the top end. So we talk about innovation, we think tech and so on, but there's a lot of innovation in other things and in more basic manufacturing. And we're not very good at the vocational side of things either, it turns out. So the UK and the US are particularly bad, actually, at the vocational side of things. And then you do look at examples like Germany and others that are better at that. Not everyone has to go to college. And in particular, if you are able to be a successful welder, plumber, whatever it happens to be, you're going to do a lot better, especially in an AI world, than somebody who spends a lot of money to go to college for a degree that doesn't really help them find a job that actually exists, that actually is produced by the economy of tomorrow.
Thank you. Given the turbulence in the markets in the global economic sphere over the last few months, does the Growth Commission have a strategy by which we can reduce our dependence on the United States and have a collaborative and fair relationship with China in the years ahead?
We do, and we actually we just released, actually, I think a couple of weeks ago, a white paper on the approach that countries and the corporate sector and other stakeholders should adopt with regard to the Trump trade, what we're calling the emerging Trump tariff doctrine, if you will, which is not just a tariff doctrine, it's also a doctrine related to elimination of anti-competitive regulation in the US. And one of the things that we recommend is there are two things that countries should do. One is reduce your own levels of distortion that are destroying wealth out of your own economy, improve your own economy, because actually many of the things that the US administration wants from its trading partners are a reduction of those things, basically. So if you look at the National Trade Estimate, which is the inventory of foreign country trade barriers, you look at most of those things, they are mostly regulatory, non-tariff barriers. So reduce those, and you will be in a better position to do a deal with the US administration. The UK has done well in that regard to actually get on the playing field first. But it is only a first step. You know, there has to be a whole set of things that have to happen. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is deepen your integration with other trading partners outside of the US. And you are starting to see that, actually. And you're starting to see things happen that have never happened before. Like in Africa, the sort of African trade agreement, they are talking about non-tariff barriers in a way they never did before. Korea is talking about acceding to the CPTPP with an increased sort of drive than they have before. So you're seeing actually a lot more integration in the rest of the world. The UK as a middle power needs to play both games. And with regard to China, I think, and this is generally true of all countries, I think what we need to have is a relationship and a set of signals with China that is basically, we do not oppose your cheap imports, provided they come as a result of economic efficiency and ordinary market processes. But where you are distorting your market for trade advantage, you can expect that we will have robust defense mechanisms against that. And I think if we're able to give those signals, that may help in the overall process in China. There are people, as you know better than anyone, there are people in China who are more reform-minded, even within the government structure. They are very silent at the moment. We need to give them oxygen. And I think if we play that signal correctly, then we'll be able to live with China in the global economy, which is obviously preferable to some massive decoupling or something like that.
Thank you. If I may ask two very short questions. Firstly, how key are big infrastructure projects to growth? Richard touched on them obliquely, rather negatively. First of all, Heathrow, which is reported to possibly give 0.43% increase in GDP by 2050, and the Lower Thames Crossing, which reportedly will be worth up to 190 billion by 2050. So how key are those? And second question is, how key is productivity to growth? We're supposed to be the sick man of Europe regarding productivity.
I didn't really catch the question, but if the question is how key is productivity to growth, the two are hugely interconnected. And it's unfortunately an area that the UK has gone backwards very substantially in the last 20 or 30 years. There's two aspects to productivity. I touched on the first in my talk a little earlier. Productivity in the public sector is utterly lamentable. And I think we can see that with the outcomes for very substantial expenditure. When the state was a small proportion of GDP, it didn't matter so much, but when it's approaching half the economy, it matters a lot. So we are tying one hand behind our back. I didn't hear all the question, but I think some of it was about infrastructure as well. If it was about infrastructure, the UK's record in infrastructure is again lamentable. To my earlier example of the bridge that was built in the Victorian period in 6 months, contrast that with the cost and timeframes of infrastructure projects in the UK. There have been various studies which I'm giving you from recollection, but to build a mile of rail in the UK costs about 10 times what it costs in France. And there's just no good reason why that should be the case. China is building effectively the size of the entire UK energy network every 3 years. From having no motorways whatsoever, and I know China's a much bigger country, so the comparisons are not entirely justified, but China is building thousands of miles of motorway each year. If we continue to clog our system up with hugely inefficient procurement, there's only one solution. We're going to get poorer, and we are getting poorer. This is a critical factor to address, and much of it is regulation. Much of it is regulation. And I think an urgent task of a good government is to go through, and this is a line-by-line task, almost everything that has been acted over the last 20 years with a presumption to repeal.
And I agree with all that on regulation. Basically, the problem in the UK is it takes too long to do things and they're too expensive. And regulation is the key reason. But reforming regulation is incredibly difficult because what happens when you have a regulatory overload like we do is you build a whole sector of people, a whole incumbent group of people who fight very hard against your regulatory reform efforts. And you've seen that in the UK in the last few years. So that's why we focus in the Growth Commission on the GDP per capita impact of these things, because we want to be able to say to people, if you change this, it's whatever it is, £2,000 per household per year, £3,000 per household per year. That is the cost that you are paying for that large incumbent to have their way. And we need to start having that kind of discussion and debate. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to fix any of these things.
Can I just come back on one other small point? The Financial Conduct Authority, there's numbers from my recollection, but they're broadly right. What do you reckon its annual budget is? 10 million? 20 million? It's actually 750 million and employs about 5,000 people. This is a huge impediment. And by the way, many of their regulations add cost very substantially for very limited benefit. There's just one example. There has to be a genuine ripping up of the quangocracy of this country. It doesn't mean to say there'll be no quangos, doesn't mean to say there's no regulation. I'm not an anarchist. But frankly, it needs to be cut, not by 5%, not by 10%, by 50, 60, 70% in many cases.
Thank you. A lot of young people that I know who are ambitious and who want to start businesses and innovate and drive the economy see no future here. It's very depressing how they view the UK, and they don't see it as a place to build something. So what does it take to build an attractive future that can retain up-and-coming talent for the people who will drive innovation in the future?
I think that's a very good question. I wouldn't despair, you and your friends and colleagues. The fixes that we've suggested here that would create a much higher level of GDP per capita growth year on year are transformative of the country, right? So if you look at the way the UK was relative to other US states, for example, in the early 2000s, what does that mean? It means the opportunities of people coming out of universities. What are their opportunities? Their opportunities were similar. When you're 40% poorer the opportunities are totally different. So the first thing we've got to do is start growing again, giving people those opportunities, lifting people out of poverty, and all of those things. And other countries are doing it. So it's not a global phenomenon that we've got this low level of growth. But part of what we want to do in the Growth Commission is explain all this to people, so that people like you and your friends start to get a bit angry about the fact that the governments have repeatedly failed to deliver on these things, because these are not things that just happen to the UK. These are things that have been deliberately done, either through action or inaction, by successive governments. It didn't have to be this way. So I would say, make your voice known. I think that there's no reason why the UK can't start growing again. It's got a lot of countries would kill for the basic requirements, the university system, the education system, the soft power of the UK, the language, the time zone. I mean, there are so many things in the UK's favour. But it's not going to change unless, frankly, people start demanding that it changes.
The good news is this can be turned around. But I'll just give you two examples. Argentina and the Czech Republic. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world 100 years ago, and it's made poor decision after poor decision after poor decision. There's never hope for that country now. But we are on the road to Argentina if we continue with our current policies. Poland was a basket case post-communism. Look at it today. It can be turned around, but only with the right policies.
Hello, I'm speaking from the pointy end as a founder of a company in the UK which recycles a third of the country's waste electronics. So I can tell you from real life that the reason why my company's productivity is going down is because every time I employ someone to do a real job, make something, produce something, I've got to employ 2 people to complete the compliance and regulatory stuff that we're under at the moment. And I wouldn't mind that if it actually made the system work. But the whole point of regulation is to stop the rogue players. But it doesn't stop the rogue players because we have a current civil service who are employed to enforce this regulation, and they're made up of kids coming out of university that have no experience. They would rather come to my company every week, and I mean every week, to complete audits that they repeat and they repeat and they repeat. What they won't do is listen to us telling them about the rogue player down the road who is exporting waste illegally. Will they go to him and stop him? No, because they haven't got the right sort of kid in there that will take them on. So the whole regulatory framework is just a burden to us under which we are sinking. Meanwhile, the rogue players are free to do what they want. So until we reform our civil servants, we're going nowhere.
Yeah.
100% agree.
I very much agree with that. The problem with the government in the UK, as I've seen it, and again, I've worked in many, many countries, is that it's quite interesting to watch the cabinet table, because cabinet members are they have these levers that are not attached to anything. There's no power at the cabinet table at all. The power, what actually happens, how the country is actually governed, and it's not even the civil service only. It's a combination of civil servants, many of whom are trying to do the right thing, with quangos that Ewen referred to, of large incumbent companies that don't want anything to ever change, and the two combine together in this sort of sclerotic environment to prevent anything from happening. So how do you fix this? So right now, if you are the permanent secretary of a department, you are accountable to the cabinet secretary. You are not accountable to your minister. You don't really care who your minister is, frankly. Unfortunately, the civil service has also been gutted at the mid-level management level. People in their 50s who know something. They've all gone. So you have the permanent secretaries responsible to the cabinet secretary operating like a minister, and then you have a 25-year-old kid who doesn't have any experience, and there's no guidance generally. So how do you solve it? I think there's only one way to solve it, and if governments are not serious about doing this, they're not serious about reform. Anything else is tinkering. You must have political appointments all the way down to Director General level in the civil service. This is what happens in the US. A new government comes in and they appoint people, and this does not mean political cronies, it means experts. It means people who have experience, people like you. I mean, people who know what they are doing. And you have those people, and then you can rely on the very good young civil servants who, with direction, will do the right thing. The reason they do what they do to you is because they have no direction. They have no experience and no direction. You give them direction, I'm confident they will do a much better job.
Thank you. You made mention earlier on about Argentina, and I've got a question about actually the simplification of the tax system. Over in Argentina, they're seeing really, really big growth at the minute, and one of the things that they've done is they simplified the tax system. And I remember reading something, and whilst their leader appears to be a bit of a madman, he's also somewhat radical. Is it that the UK should get to, I think he wants to get over there to something like only 6 different forms of taxation in Argentina. That's his plan. Is that something that the UK should therefore be doing? And just on the subject of Argentina, there's a load of oil under the Falklands, so should we also be drilling that as well?
I'm greatly in favour of tax simplicity. We have one of the most complicated tax codes in the world. No one can think ahead. We have no idea what Rachel Reeves is going to do. She might change pensions, she might change corporation tax, she might change housing tax. How can anyone plan in that environment? The state clearly has to raise money whether we like it or not. We need simple taxes that are easily understood. Let's put accountants out of business and make it very simple. And if governments put taxes up, it becomes extremely obvious. And I think in time they'll vote for the opposite. In terms of Argentina, it's in terms of the Falklands, it's a UK crown dependency. We should certainly look to explore those assets.
Yeah, I think you need to generate energy everywhere and in every way you possibly can right now, because we are barely scratching the surface of the actual energy demand. If you think about the energy demand of AI data centers and so forth, I mean, Ireland can't build any AI data centers because its energy cost is too high. So think what that's going to do to the Irish economy going forward. Just on taxes, there are lots of countries that have flat taxes. Estonia has a flat tax. Lots of countries have flat taxes. If you look at, there's a very good study on the movement of people in the United States from certain states to certain other states. And the states which have no state income tax are the ones that are attracting huge movements of people from California to Texas to other states, huge movements of people from New York to Florida and other states like that. The beauty of the US is it's a 50-state laboratory. You can see what policies work and what policies don't. We should learn from this. We know what causes people to actually produce more, to engage in more economic activity. And certainly, I think, if you want a radical solution, consider a flat tax.
Can we come back to this subject of education? Because at the moment, I was talking to a group of 12 young people the other day. 2 of them wanted to work abroad. One wanted to set up his own company, but that's only because his parents were running their own companies and it was in the electronics sector and he knew that was all about. All the rest wanted to go to work for some form of government body. And that seems to be... so I said, why is that the case? And they said, well, that's what we're told is the safe and secure, way to go. So we're either encouraged to go to university to get a pointless degree and amass a huge debt that we then pay the rest of our lives trying to get rid of, or we don't pay it off because we then go and become a barista when we come out of university, which is all we can aspire to, or we go and work for the government. And I sort of probed into that a little bit more, and I said, well, hang on a second. So if I said growth to you, what does that mean? And they sort of looked at each other and said, oh, it's a sort of word that's bandied about by Rachel from accounts and lots of other people. I said, what about wealth? Oh, no, that's very much a dirty word. You know, it is a negative context. And entrepreneurship as well. So my question to you is, it's about how do we change the narrative for young people aspiring to come up through the system. Obviously, some of the things you're talking about are absolutely right, and we're talking to the converted here. But for young people, how do you change the narrative in our education system to give them that proper view of what we should be aspiring for?
Yeah, I mean, that is something we are very focused on. I mean, not only the Growth Commission, but I also have an Institute for Human Flourishing that looks at how, you know, particularly with respect to young people and how they think about these things. Because, you know, one of the problems we have, both in the US and in the UK, actually in Western Europe as well, is the sort of massive indoctrination of our kids in schools and universities, so that they believe that capitalism is this terrible thing, wealth is this dirty word. And I've said to them, and I speak at lots of universities and schools and things, and I've said to them, you know, I've written 4 books on economic growth and trade and competition, all these things, 200 articles. I've never once mentioned the word capitalism, because capitalism is Marx's word, it's Weber's word. It means those who have capital are the oppressors, and those who don't have capital are the oppressed. We talk about voluntary exchange, willing buyers and willing sellers coming together to solve human need. If you start using that language with young people, that's what they want to do. That is where they want to go. And then I've had these conversations with them where, you know, I've said, so what is it that you don't like actually about capitalism? And they'll give all these examples, and every single one is an act of cronyism. It's an incumbent, powerful player distorting the marketplace through regulation or through some nefarious conduct. So actually, they don't, you know, we have a shared language if we would only use it, but we have to be very careful with our words. I would expunge the word capitalism from our dictionary. It is not our word. Why would we use it? Talk about mutual exchange, talk about voluntary, talk about willing buyers and willing sellers coming together to meet human need. And they want to do that. That's exactly what they want to do. But it's a process, because you've got to unpick and undo a lot of indoctrination that they frankly have faced and because so many of the people work, as you said, in government, they work in government, they don't work in economic activity creating things, they don't understand the process of of wealth creation, and they need to learn that. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen now. It used to happen, you know, in our day. You went to work, as Churchill said, you know, if you're not a socialist at 20, you haven't got a heart. If you're not a capitalist, at 40, you haven't got a head. That's what happens to you. You go out into the workplace, you see how wealth is created, you see how incentives work, and you change your views. If you go into the government, you don't see these things. And so part of it is, as Ewen said, reducing the size of the state, increasing the size of the private sector, showing people that they really want to be working in jobs where they're creating things and making things. And I think, honestly, that's what most young people actually do want to do.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Is the UK still competitive in foreign direct investment in manufacturing? And what advice would you give a reform government to make us more competitive in that area?
In areas it's competitive, but the areas are far too small. So if you look at Britain's industrial base, if you look at our exports, services now account for roughly 2/3 of our exports. We run a massive fiscal deficit. There's some bright spots, elements of high-end engineering, food industries, etc., drinks industries, but the base is very small. There's another concerning factor that the average age of a British employee is about 40. In the manufacturing sector, it's about 50, just under 50. So there's been a lack of people have gone into, and it's not a quick fix. I mean, we've got to make ourselves competitive. How do we do that? Lower energy prices. We can't do that immediately because with an inbuilt system, it's dishonest to say we can change overnight, but we can start to move the dial. We've got to realize that the cost base is completely wrong against other parts of the world. And if we want to be serious about reindustrializing, we've got to address that cost base. Regulation is part of it, and being honest about salaries is part of it. The minimum wage is making the UK uncompetitive in many areas. It's a big, big challenge, but we've got to try and reverse what's been a 50-year decline, frankly.
Yeah, I would say, the sort of famous slogan is, capital is a coward, it flows where it's welcome. There's a lot of competition for that capital right now. And if you've got the energy costs that you've got, energy isn't everything. So you're just whacking up your cost. If your labor market is inflexible, I mean, we're less inflexible than continental Europe, but that is not a high bar. And that's not where the competition is coming from anyway. Then you're going to be very, if I'm in the C-suite of a company and I'm looking around where I'm going to put my next factory, my next opportunity, I'm going to look at energy cost, I'm going to look at labor rules, I'm going to look at regulatory burden, I'm going to look at tax burden. We fail on all of those levels, and other countries don't. So we fail also because of the length of time it takes to build anything. I mean, we've got AI companies, data centers, small modular nuclear reactors and they're not going to, very exotic countries. They're going to Holland, they're going to Hungary, they're going to Poland, not the UK, because of our regulatory burden and the length of time it takes to do anything. The fact that we've said that we're not going to produce any serious energy. I mean, by serious, I mean baseload energy, which is fossil fuels or nuclear. We're not going to do any of that, and nuclear is taking so long to do. I mean, that again is a huge signal to those companies, which we should, as a country, the UK ought to be an energy leader. Given the resources that we have, given the companies that we have, we should be an energy leader. But all those companies are looking, frankly, at going somewhere else. So that's the challenge we have.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the clock is about to strike 2, so I'm afraid that our time together this lunchtime is coming to an end. I hope you agree it's been an invigorating 90 minutes of discussion about economic growth, which is the vital issue of our times, and one that politicians and policymakers absolutely need to address with urgency. The Growth Commission is delighted to be engaging with politicians and policymakers of all political hues in order to put forward the positive ideas that we've been talking about today about how we can get our economies growing, and the UK economy in particular. I do hope you'll keep abreast of what we're doing. Do go to growth-commission.com, our website, and keep up with our work. As I said, the leaflet on your chair has a QR code, which if you scan, it'll take you to the sign-up form to sign up to our emails, so you can keep in touch with us and get regular updates on all our work. All that remains is to thank you very much for joining us and to invite you to thank our Growth Commissioners.